Greetings, everybody. This is a lecture by Kelly Ingram. My name's Kelly Ingram. I am the program director for the Masters in Communication Disorders program at ASU. And I've been asked today to talk about alternative and augmentative communication. So I'm going to go through some slides. I'll share my screen with you, which is my PowerPoint, and talk a little bit about what AAC is and some issues related to AAC. And that'll probably be about 20 minutes of me talking. And then in addition, I will share some YouTube links with you, which I'll have you stop this video or this presentation and then access the Google form with the various links, and I'll cue you during the presentation as to when you're to go to those. And they're approximately 15 minutes of videos. Each of them are about 3 or 4 minutes long, and then that'll supplement what I'll be speaking about today. Okay, so to start off with, just want to state that communication is the essence of life. ASHA came out, the American Speech and Hearing Association came out with that in 1991, and it really is how we establish our identities. And so individuals who have an inability to communicate need another vehicle so that they can establish who they are and connect with people. So why do we communicate? Well, the first thing is the social connection. We talk to people on the phone, we talk to people everywhere we go, establish that level of closeness, and that's a very valuable part about who we are, how we reflect on things and so forth. But we also use communication, obviously, to get stuff, to ask for things, and then also to tell about stuff. So your day, or to information like today. So I'm telling you about AAC. So that's 3 primary reasons for communication. And so all of those items need to be built into any system that a person who can't communicate through spoken language would use. So a definition for what AAC is, based on a definition from ASHA, is that it is something that will compensate for either a temporary or a permanent impairment, activity limitation, or restriction in participation for individuals that have a severe disorder of speech and language, or comprehension. So AAC can also be used to help people understand language and communication, in addition to them being able to produce communication. And so keep that in mind, because I think traditionally we think of AAC as production, being able to produce speech, but it also can aid in comprehension. Clients who use AAC, there's a wide range of clients that can use it, but we tend to break them down into individuals who have a motor-based impairment. So they're having difficulty talking because of a dysarthria, so a motor speech disorder that affects their ability to produce speech. So that would be dysarthria and apraxia. Apraxia is a motor planning production problem, and dysarthria is more of a muscular-based problem, or upper motor or lower motor neuron problem that affects the ability to control speech, and often results in unintelligible productions of speech. But we also have clients with language impairments. They can be a neurogenic language impairment, so they're acquired. So aphasia would be as a result of somebody who's had a stroke and has lost the language system or access to the language system that they had. And so that's that's not speech production, it's that they can't access the words that they want used in order to communicate. Autism, language-based problem, and then also traumatic brain injury, or just developmental language issues as well, might result in a reason for why somebody might need an aided system of communication. When we look at communication, we can think of ways to help a person communicate either through a conventional means or a non-conventional means. So conventional is when the person is using a system that conforms to a normal system. So most other people would understand their gestures, their written language, their spoken language. It is based on basically a language system. Whereas non-conventional is made up. It's a made up system that the user and their communication partner understands, almost like a coded language, but other people in the general environment would not understand. So I'll show you here, there's a graphic of that. So on the left, the communication board that says, I want, and then the person can choose book, help, eat, sleep, I want to sleep, and so forth. Even if you didn't speak English or read, from the icons, you might be able to understand that the message that's being conveyed there, whether you knew the person or not. It's a conventional means of communication. And then also the hand with the signing, that's conventional in that a large number of people who sign would recognize the sign that's being produced. Whereas the non-conventional is, like I had mentioned, coded. So this is an example of an E-Tran board, which is used for eye linking. So you would hold this up in front of you, and you would be, the client that you're working with, it's implied by this particular type of device or this particular low-tech communication, that the person probably has severe motor impairments and cannot touch anything, and need to rely on eye gaze in order to communicate. So you might put this board in front of a person it's made out of plexiglass. You're on one side, they're on the other side, and you follow their eyes. So if they look up towards, well, let's go with the example. So they look to the middle upper section of the board where the F is, then, well, actually, let me back up, sorry. The first thing they would probably do is look up at the blue corner, the corner there that's blue. So there's blue, red, green, and yellow. They look up at that. So you know that they're going to be signaling you with a blue letter. And then you look towards the middle upper quadrant. And so you would know that the letter is F. And then they look at a 1, and you would code for F1. And then that would be representative of hamburger. So the person can communicate these different concepts based on the coded system. And so you as a user would need to know it, and you as a communication partner would need to know it. It's only going to get you so far, but it's basic communication, and it's better than no communication at all. Okay. We also need to think about a continuum of communication for individuals. Some individuals are very, very impaired. Some head injured clients have almost no real communication system, and they're dependent on their partner. So for instance, a client who has no spoken abilities and has little intent to communicate because of brain injury may use things like salivation. So if they salivate, that's a signal to their communication partner that they're hungry. Or they might use a scream when they're excited, and that might signal that something makes them happy. So in that kind of system, the person is highly dependent on their communication partner. And AAC takes the form of trying to understand what are all those signals, the signals that the person uses who can't truly communicate, what do they mean, and what is the response to those particular acts of communication, even if they're very low level communication. And then there's a continuum of how much support that person needs or a person needs. And so the supported communication would be an example being, say, maybe somebody with aphasia who can't initiate what they want, but if a communication partner puts a board in front of them of choices, so a choice of maybe what they want for dinner, chicken, hamburger, pizza, steak, and then says which of the following would you like and points to those items, and then the individual with aphasia is able to point or say or indicate somehow what they would like. That would be a supported communication attempt. And then it goes all the ways up to independent, where they need maybe a system to help them communicate, but they don't need a partner to help them to communicate. So an example, a lot of the clients that I work with professionally are individuals who have ALS. And so they don't have a problem with language or cognition generally. They just have a restriction on their motor ability to either speak or even sometimes touch a device. And so when they're given a device like an eye gaze device and they can use their eyes to type out messages, then the machine will say the message for them and they'll use the language that, let's just say English. They use English to type out the message, the machine says it, and the listener responds, just like a regular communication partner. Those individuals are considered independent users, even though they need a device. They don't need support from a communication partner. Okay. So when we're doing AAC intervention, the first thing you need to do is take a look at where that person falls on that communication continuum to determine how much support are they going to need. And then your communication needs assessment is taking a look at their lives and their communication partners and what they need to communicate and figuring out who they say what to, when they need to say it, where they need to say it, and building that into a communication system for them so that you're meeting all their needs, social needs, ability to tell about stuff, and ability to ask questions. Sometimes it's just basic needs and wants. Sometimes it's a lot more than that. You're going to look at what their restrictions are. So they may have motor restrictions. They may not be able to move certain parts of their body or any part of their body. They might have restrictions in their linguistic capacity. So they have a lower language level. And then they also may have cognitive problems that involve maybe planning or attention or memory that also have to be accounted for when you're thinking of the system. So you're going to be thinking about strategies that are going to help them right now. And you're also going to be thinking about strategies that will help them in the future. So for going back to my clients with ALS, when I first see them, quite often they are able to communicate relatively well. but they are progressive in their disorder, and I know that they're going to get to a point where they have very limited speech ability and limited motor ability. And so thinking of systems that they can use now and then perhaps could use in the future so that it would grow with them. Same thing is opposite with the child. You want something that would grow with them in the reverse, so that something, as they're developing language, it could be very simple in the beginning, but when they're 4, 5, 6 years of age and have a more robust vocabulary and need to communicate, you need systems that they can use for those environments. You have to develop intervention objectives, and then there's always, as a speech language pathologist, you want to have a way to measure outcomes and success. So going to the options for AAC, it's broken down into vocal and non-vocal. So that means whether it's actually whether there's a noise behind it. So vocal is that there's noise. So crying and laughing and vocalizations and that type of thing, those are vocal, there's noise there, versus non-vocal, sign language, written language, pointing, gestures, there's no noise. And then on the left-hand side there, the verbal refers to whether it's language-based or not. So sometimes people use verbal and vocal interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. So verbal means that there's a verb or a language-related issue to it. And so speech is verbal, whereas crying and laughing does not have a language system behind it, so it would be considered non-verbal. And then within the systems, there's aided and non-aided. So speech and sign language, there's no board, there's no device, there's nothing. It's just spoken language and sign language with your body, but no external device. And then verbal aided would be where there is a device, a speech generating device, or a communication board for the non-vocal device. Sorry, I guess device or object that supports the communicator. Okay, so that's kind of how we break down the different types of systems, and that's kind of just background knowledge that you have to think about when you're developing systems. All right, so let's get into some actual what AAC looks like. So low-tech AAC is essentially supported. It is, there is an actual device that you're giving the person to use, but it doesn't rely on any technology. It's low-tech. So it's generally, could be written language, but it's often pictures and it's tangible items. Could be real objects or pictures, photographs or icons, that type of thing where the client points or looks at the item, and then you as a communication partner know what they're trying to convey. On the right-hand side, there are some there's Velcro strips and pictures, and often that type of thing is used with clients with autism, where they might take the item off and hand it to you. Some of those pictures aren't the greatest, but there's a banana that you can clearly see. And so if they're not speaking, they might be able to take off the banana and hand it to you in order to get the banana. There is a program called PECS, the Picture Exchange Communication System, where a lot of clients with autism learn to use that as a method to indicate what they want. So right now is a time for you to stop this video and go take a look at the examples that I have given you, and I will actually escape out of here and open up, hopefully, let's hit in here, my example. So this is, you should have access to this within Canvas. So I have low-tech AAC boards and a little information about them, the fact that they can be organized in a variety of ways to support communication. And then here's a YouTube video that I'd like you to watch. And so it's an example of a communication board that allows the communicator to create sentences. So it's set up so that there's core words. So core words would be words that you use all the time, like don't, or more, and so forth, that are common vocabulary words that are high frequency. And then fringe are words that are specific usually to a particular topic. So if I was doing a cooking activity, more and stir and my turn, those types of things would be considered core, but things like chocolate chip and flour would be considered fringe, because those would be specific to the actual task that you're doing. And so this communication board is set up that way. So go ahead and watch that video. And then you can come back to the presentation. All right. Okay, I'm going to just assume you've restarted, and we'll talk about high tech. So high tech is any device, whether it be an iPad or a dedicated device by a company that uses a technology behind it to create speech. So speech can be recorded. So you can have a device like the Go Talk 20 there that's in the middle, where those buttons are, somebody would have pushed the button and recorded their voice, and the voice would be saved on it. And then when the communication user used it, they press the button and it says, I have a question, and whatever is recorded on there. Whereas the other two devices that are shown there are called, those are devices that have synthesized or computerized type speech. So in the background behind the button, somebody has typed in a message that the computer then generates a computerized speech for, either in a female voice, a male voice, whatever, and voices have gotten pretty good over the years. And those are both considered high-tech type devices. So again, go back to the different video clips that I've given you and take a look. I've given you some examples of, actually I've given you one example. So again, I'll close this down and open this up of a high-tech device. So there again, I say if it has voice output, it can be digitized, which is recorded, or synthesized. And there's many, many different devices out there. And here's an example of an high-tech software that is on an iPad, and the product is called Touch Chat. And it's the same kind of software that would be on a dedicated device. I just happen to like this YouTube video. So take a look at that and then meet me back in the lecture. Okay. All right. So the tablets have really changed the face of AAC. So tablets and iPads are, for the past 10 years or so, have really changed, because pretty much everybody can get apps that will help them communicate, or anybody that needs it. they're available for different linguistic levels. Prior to that, it was really the case that people had to use devices that were very, very expensive and are classified as medical durable equipment, and were often quite bulky. And now people who are using the devices that are more streamlined, they just look like everybody else out there using a phone and a tablet. And so they don't stand out quite as much, which is nice. But the problem with tablets and iPads are that they are not always adequate for the communication user. So you have to take a look at their cognitive level and their language ability, and see if they're actually able to use the device somewhat independently, or what type of support do they need from a communication partner. And I think in general, that's one of the problems, is that people tend to think, oh, you give them a communication device, a box that will talk for you. But if you have an internal problem with language and language formulation, you can't use a box to talk for you. You have a problem with language, regardless of whether it's spoken or through a device. The other issue is if a person has a motor restriction, how are they going to access the device? And so that's kind of what we'll be talking about next. Oh, no, it's not what we're talking about next. The thing we're talking about next is think about symbols. So symbols and icons, sometimes they're very transparent. You look at it and you can tell exactly what it means. So for instance, a picture of a dog would probably represent a dog, whereas this picture here is pretty easy to tell what it is, but not all individuals who use AAC would look at this and know what it means. So you have to think about, does the client who's actually using it understand what they're looking at and pointing at? And you can't assume that they do. So you have to test for that. So this here represents think, which I think most of you would probably be able to pick out. Some items like some adjectives in particular, surprise, maybe you could do, or thoughtful, or just trying to think of things that would be hard. Even words like celebration, representation, those types of things, those are hard to convey through an icon. And so it does limit the clients a fair bit. When you're setting up a display, you want to think about how many items on one page can a client handle? Can the client handle understanding that something might be embedded under a category? So if you on your page you have a picture of food, do they understand that when you hit the icon or the picture of food, that might open up another whole selection of food items? Or if you have a page of foods and you have them classified as fruit and meats and breads and so forth, and then under each of those icons there are exemplars that are like different kinds of fruit, apples, bananas, pears. Will the person understand that they can access that vocabulary by finding the category? And some of our clients cannot do that. So that's something you have to look at. And then of course the size and weight and how they're going to carry it around needs to be considered as well. All right, so now we're getting to the type of access. So this is more based on motor than it is on linguistic and cognitive. So some people have the ability to access directly. They have the ability to access either through pointing or using their eyes, but looking directly at what they want to communicate. That you can use a head pointer. And so there's a bunch of different ways that you can set up, but it's called direct access. And so I do have some videos on direct access for you to look at. And so let's go back to here. So direct selection, it's called here. And so there are two different videos. One, I think you can understand how somebody would access something directly with their finger. But I've given you a video of an individual with cerebral palsy who has a head-mounted pointer that he's using on his device. And then the second video is more of a tutorial than it is a client so much. There's a client in it, but it's a tutorial on how eye gaze access works. So where you're just staring at a screen and the screen is reading your eyes and where your eyes are. So again, clients that are locked in because of a brain trauma to the brain stem, or a client with ALS who's deteriorated to the point where they can't move anything, would probably be using an eye gaze access method like this. Okay. And then I'll just mention, because rather than toggle back and forth, but I'll go to the slide on indirect access in a second. But the next slide is indirect access. So here it's when you cannot directly access through, say, eye gaze has opened up a lot of avenues, but not everybody can do eye gaze. It's very tiring. It's taxing like crazy. Sometimes people have difficulty controlling their head movements, and then eye gaze does not work at all. Also, sometimes people have droopy eyes or head droop and can't use eye gaze. So even though now we use eye gaze whenever possible, there are still some clients that need to use an indirect access. So they use a switch somewhere on their body where they start scanning. They start the program so that it scans for them. And so this particular video is, it's all indirect, it's all through scanning. And it's a video that's, again, a bit of a tutorial on what scanning is and different types of scanning that is available. And the different types of scanning is essentially so that you can maximize the client's ability to speed up the process of selecting what they want to communicate. Some types of scanning, if you have to do step-by-step scanning, is very slow. So you want to try to maximize the efficiency of scanning. And so go ahead and watch that. And when you're done with that, I'll meet you back in the PowerPoint. Okay, so this is just a slide on access. I assume you've already watched both the direct access as well as the indirect access for communication. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of the lecture, but I want to mention a few more things about apps. As I'd mentioned before, there are a large number of apps now that are available for clients. Some are expensive and some are very cheap, or inexpensive, I guess I should say. So the ones that tend to run a little more expensive, like Touch Chat, Prolog Q2Go, even Verbally, although Verbally has an inexpensive option, they're ones that are set up as a language system, a generative language system. So usually you've seen Touch Chat, because that was the product I had you look at for the high tech. They're dynamic in that when you touch a cell, it brings up a new page. There's a lot of programming that has gone into those language systems that allow people to create novel utterances. And so that's why they're generative. So they're not just pre-recorded messages on a button. And they're much more flexible systems. And so they tend to be more expensive. Whereas there are quite a few programs out there that are less expensive, and they tend to be either ones where you can store a whole message on a button. So you would have maybe, I want to go to the store. I like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. So everything would be stored in a location, and the person would access it. Or the other kind of device that's inexpensive is a type and talk. So the client, and a lot of my clients who still have good motor but lose their speech, they will use programs where they type the message and then the device just talks for them. And you can store some phrases, but you don't need a whole lot of pictures as long as you have good written language. And so those are inexpensive, usually $2 an app. And then there's basically a third kind of app, which is like Pictello, which is a app that's set up for mainly for social communication. So it's stored as well. So the communicator or the communication partner sets up these different scenarios for the client in the app so that the person can use it generally to socially connect. So they're if they go to a group setting, they can say, let me tell you about my trip. And then they turn the page on the device. And I went to Chicago last weekend. And so this is all stored, but it allows the person to tell the story to someone else. And so Pictello is an example of a pretty nice app that is used for that purpose. And so if you go back to the examples that I've given you, you can go ahead and take a look at that particular app. Okay, so just to wrap up my discussion of AAC, it's very important that when you are working in the field of AAC, that you're focusing on real communication and the communicator, not the actual use of technology. And so what I mean by that is sometimes therapists will write goals that are centered around the client being able to use the device rather than the client's ability to communicate with the device. So you want to think of real situations where the client could use the device effectively rather than just practicing finding things on the device and pushing the button. So that's important. It's also really important that you have more than one communication system for a person. People don't tend to use just one communication system. So if they can use a head nod or a noise or something to indicate things like yes and no and some simple phrases, then you want to be able to use those in most circumstances rather than a device. No one's going to want to use their device to answer yes if they have a different system. So having some words that are like yes and no on a device usually is useless because most people have another method. In addition to the fact that when you have high-tech devices break down. We all know that from our computers and our iPads and so forth. So you want to make sure that they have systems in place for when that does happen, that they're not left without a communication system. It's a big, big myth that using AAC will inhibit speech or language. There's tons of evidence out there that AAC supports speech and language growth. And so when family members of young children who need AAC feel sometimes that that's going to hold their child back, it's been shown that usually the support, if the child is going to be able to speak, using the device along with their communication actually helps them produce some speech and helps them develop language. And going back to the core and fringe, you really do want to use a lot of generic and high frequency words rather than teaching a lot of vocabulary specific words that may not be as important for overall communication. And then the last point is really that no one, unless they're the very independent user, somebody who's just like you and me, if you right now had to use a device rather than spoken production to communicate, you probably would be very good because you have normal language and normal cognitive skills. But if you, most clients that are young and haven't learned language yet, or somebody who's has an acquired deficit, they aren't going to pick up the device and use it. So the only way you're going to really get good use is if you yourself as a communication partner or therapist are modeling it in authentic situations so that they can see you using it. Just like when children develop language, they're developing the language based on models that they're hearing all the time. So the same thing is with a child that's going to have to use a device for communication, you have to be modeling using the device for communication, not just instructing them on how to use it. And so I think that's it on AAC. I hope you learned a few things that you didn't know previously, and just be aware that it's an incredibly rewarding area of speech language pathology, because there are often times that you're providing a vehicle for clients that otherwise would not be able to socialize, get stuff, or tell about stuff. Thank you.